Chapter 41, Alone. Alone. The low sun was hot on his back and Baldur was glad of his pack there, however heavy, shielding him from the worst, the bag emptied previously into his tent to make room for the supplies they had been dispatched to get. At his side, Imoen indulged in a wide yawn, one hand held ever before her and parting the long grass that almost reached her waist on those sun-dried plains. Their snatched escape from Thine Gate was a few days behind them now. As he had rightly predicted, the others had headed for the road. Baldur had tracked them back along the path to find the rest of their company waiting in the shade of the acacia tree where they had taken a meal the previous noon, and Midsummer's Day began with neither celebrations nor ceremony, but a forced march west. All had been united in the desire to put as much distance between them and the town as was possible, but it seemed any worries of pursuit they had held were unfounded. Thine Gate had learned to its detriment the reason for the small fortune placed on Frith's head.
It didn't seem this far when we walked out,
Imoen sighed, shrugging her equally laden pack into a more comfortable position. She cocked a head to him to hear his comment on this, the simple arrangement of turquoise and gold trembling at her ears to catch, glinting, in the sunlight, a gift to herself when it had become clear that even the larger village they had just visited did not stock any books on the arcane.
I suppose the way always seems further when you long for your destination,
he offered at length.
You are eager to return with time enough to study before you retire.
Imoen just snorted and returned to her own thoughts. Though contrary to all he hoped to feel, Baldur knew that, at one time, there would have been some glimmer of relief at her disinclination towards her studies. But since Thine Gate, the power Imoen held, and seemingly without any study or practice, scared him more than he would ever admit to her. And it was not only the idea that she knew such spells, but that they did not even tire her. Even a master mage would have been exhausted by such a display. Imoen's blithe ignorance revealed as he had questioned her on this, and she had laughingly reminded him that there was a whole lot of weave for her to draw on. But he could not lecture her, not when he had stood and drained the life from a man with magic vile enough that only Diril or Lavik would have dabbled in it. However, his reluctance had not stopped Jahara and, surprisingly, Fritha from giving Imoen a stern talking to, the druid's complaints stemming from the danger to the town's populace, Fritha's from the increased danger to them. He could see the girl's point. She needed no more excuses for people to hunt her, but it was a logic for which Imoen had still yet to forgive them, the girl in a mood with all but himself ever since.
Remember Jahara said she wants to look at your hand tonight,
offered Imoen suddenly, and giving an insight as to what was pressing upon her thoughts.
We can see if you've done it any damage. I told you, it is fine. You've been training it too hard, don't think I don't notice you wincing every time I touch it. It needs the training to make it stronger,
he countered mulishly, though he did so under his breath. She was right, he had been pushing it too hard, fueled by the desire to find use again in the useless limb and never see a repeat of the fear that had brought from him powers he had never wanted to know he possessed. Solafane had refused to train with him after the first couple of days, and he had been forced to resort to performing his katas alone whenever he had the chance, the pain almost cathartic, as though he was cleaning his hand of the taint magic had left within it. If only the memory could be so purged. Each morning he awoke from dreams of the alley and that guard's withering face, eyes pleading as he had stolen the life from him. Ahead, the golden plains stretched onward. Imoen focused on the deep blotted green of the small copse they were camped beside.
I'm sure those trees are just getting further away,
she huffed, quickening her pace.
Come on, we need to make it back in enough light to check your hand.
Baldur said nothing. The page swam before her eyes, words merging into incoherent nonsense. Fritha had read the last sentence over 4 times now, the huffing of the man opposite cutting through her every effort to concentrate. Another day had drawn to a close, the sunset finding them making camp deep within the plains on the edge of a small wood, the tall grass enough to conceal their tents from the road and nearby village both. Over the fire, Jahara was adding dried onion to that evening's hodgepodge, Minsk and cellophane preparing the traps they planned to set, while Anoman was repairing his water flask. It had somehow sprung a leak over the course of the day, the tar lining inside the leather case failing near the bottom. The man had already unpicked the stitches that held together the two leather halves, and was trying with dwindling patience to use the heated blade of his knife to melt the tar enough to reseal it. Fritha watched him struggle, flask clamped awkwardly between his knees, his hands trying to maneuver a blade and hold back the leather both.
"I can hold the flask, if you want."
Anoman thrust his rapidly cooling knife back into the fire with a grunt, ignoring her offer.
"The others should be back soon,"
said Jahara over a contemplative sip. Spoon returned to the pot and stirring vigorously as she added more pepper.
"Oh, good,"
muttered Anoman, crossly raking through the glowing embers,
"and we can enjoy yet another evening of imo and sulking."
Fritha did not ask if he was worried about the competition, instead offering to help melt the tar while he held the leather aside. For his part, Anoman pretended he had not heard her and they both came out as winners as Fritha returned to her book. But it could not hold her attention, even after Anoman had finished and settled across the fire from her, quiet once more. When those about her were not a distraction, her mind had a matter it seemed more than happy to dwell upon instead, 3,000 of them, in fact, and all resting so neatly on her head. Jahara had kept the bounty notice and it was folded now in the back of Fritha's diary with the other bounties, Gorian's letter, Nalya's last farewell, and all her other memories both good and ill. 3,000 gold. She supposed she should feel insulted, for leader of the five it was not much at all. Oh, with what despairing laughter she had greeted that revelation. It seemed someone had been jumping to all the wrong conclusions and was willing to put money on it, too. Well, they were not so far off. She would have been leader of some similarly brutal campaign, if she had followed her mother's career plans. But as worrying as it all was, there was little to be done, Fritha merely hiding her hair under the tall, straw hat she had once gifted to Brianna and carrying on their journey west. She had no chain to wear now, her shirt discarded on some warehouse roof back in Nine Gate, and Fritha wondered if she even looked the part anymore. The few refugees they had passed seemed to have graver concerns pressing on them, the roads sometimes choked with people, while at other times they could walk hours without meeting another soul. Their visits to any area more populated than a hamlet were restricted now to groups of 2 and 3 that never included herself, those sent returning with supplies and the same story. Hostilities were running high, mercenaries clashing with guards in the streets, while the general populace cowered in fear of an assault that was coming from, well, a variety of unseen enemies, with anyone who did not fit facing a lynch mob, though Fritha was not sure if that was any more true than tales of dragons and jinn. In the overwound heat of a bright, scorching flame rule, careless words became rumors and rumors became truths. The whole of Tether was tensed, a cornered animal crouched in anticipation of attack. Across the fire, Cellophane and Minsk rose, the drow stooping to gather up the snares they had arranged. His cloak had fallen forward to hinder his efforts, Fritha smiling as she leaned across to give him a hand.
"Here, let me help you with that."
He wrenched the snare she had reached for back with a haste that likely jarred his arm.
"Ah, there is no need, Fritha, I am fine." "Yes, of course,"
she muttered to his retreating back, he and Minsk heading off into the plains.
"Fine, everybody's fine."
Fritha slumped again to the blanket and returned to her book. If Cellophane was withdrawn before, he had been positively clingy compared to his behavior towards her now. Ever since midsummer he seemed to have been avoiding her. Unlike the sprig of leaves given to him at Greengrass and worn in his hat until they were but dust, her flower had disappeared by noon, not even kept for the day, and since then he had avoided any situation that found them alone together. Even at night, that haven within their tent where once they would have shared talk was no longer sacred, the man turning to feign sleep as soon as his head touched the pillow. Frithha would lie awake unsleeping, too, the hollowness at her back worse than if there had been no one there at all. She had not questioned him about it, she doubted he would tell her, and a part of her did not want to ask and force him to place a lie between them. Frithha turned the page just to keep up the pretense she was reading. At the rustle, Jahara glanced from the pot with a smile.
"What are you reading there, Frithha?" "A book." "I can see that. What is it about?" "Stuff." "Frithha."
The girl drew a deep breath and forced a grin. None of this was the druid's fault, and she could hardly afford to estrange another of the few people who were still speaking to her.
"It's the tragic tale of forbidden love between sworn enemies from the furthest north. Here, I'll read you some." Gunthrak wiped goblin innards from his face with the back of one large, scarred hand, the other reaching forward to pluck a stray eyeball gently from her hair. "After this battle, I will head east to meet up with my old tribes."
A troll ran past them on fire, but Melanie could barely hear the screams over the beating of her own heart.
You're leaving? But I love you, Gunthrak." "And but our love can never be. You are an adventurer and I am a hench-orc, we are from different worlds."
Jahara was chuckling, leaning forward to bat her affectionately on the head with the spoon handle.
"Frithha, it does not say that." "It does. You can borrow it when I'm done, if you like, though I should warn you, it gets it a bit saucy later on."
The woman returned to her cooking, still snickering, and Frithha felt a bit better if only for the camaraderie of it. And true to the druid's prediction, Imoen and Valigar returned within the hour, Minsk and Solafane fast on their heels, and the group sat down to share their meal of stew and freshly baked bread. Warm dusk had yielded to a velvety twilight, the cool breeze sweeping silken over Fritha's face to sough through the grasses, stirring up the scent of baked earth and pollen. Somewhere nearby a lone cricket was trying to attract a mate, his quiet chirping almost lost to the susurrus of the trees, the canopy of the copse swaying against an indigo sky. It was all so peaceful, like those warm summer evenings in the gardens back in Candlekeep, sitting on the back step to the kitchens, the door flung wide to tempt the breeze, and Beth's singing drifting from the pantry as the old woman prepared the readers' suppers. Frithha felt her eyes begin to close. The evening's meal had left her full and pleasantly drowsy. The pack she was leaning upon was comfortable enough to serve as a bed for one who was tired enough, and perhaps Jahara noticed her lolling, for the druid's voice cut through the soporific haze.
"Come, Valigar, I must check over your hand before we retire."
Frithha forced her eyes open, watching as Jahara, Valigar, and Imoen set out for the river, where the cold water could be used to reduce the swelling of the day and let the druid get a better look at how his hand was healing. Anoman obviously heard his cue, rising as well and heading west towards the copse for the night's firewood, Minsk and Solafane moving off to check their traps. Frithha was tasked with refilling their flasks for the coming days, though there was no rush, the memories of Candlekeep compelling her to remain. Something was jarring, though, tugging at the recollections of fading light and warm grass, and she realized suddenly she was missing the scent of the flowers that should be there. There had been a fragrant herb garden behind the kitchens, but even the more ornamental flower beds before the keep had their purpose. Chamomile to soothe, chrysanthemum to wake the mind, and lavender and tansy grown to make sachets for the wardrobes and, more importantly, bookcases, the pungent parchment envelopes put behind the tomes to keep moths and silverfish at bay. In the summer, she and Imoen would often lie outside after their chores were done, soaking up the sunlight and bathing in the wafting scents until Ulrant would send someone out to move them on, and usually with a telling off for making the place look untidy. For a moment, the ache for home was heartbreaking. Frithia shifted, no longer finding the same peace in the evening, and easing herself up to fetch the 2 empty flasks Minsk had left out for her. The stream was a good walk north and much closer to the village than they would have dared camp, though Frithia doubted they would meet anyone at that hour. The long grass caught at her legs, blades tangling to a matted wall as she tried to stomp her way through with the 2 bulky flasks.
Why do I always volunteer to get the water? These things are going to weigh a bloody ton on the way.
She let her mutterings die there, disturbed by a rhythmic crack, crack, crack she could not place echoing from the gloomy woodland. Frithia tramped over to the tree line, an airy hall of grey trunks stretching off into the gloaming. The whole wood was likely only 100 yards across, slivers of indigo providing a glimpse of the plains just beyond. Frithia walked a path between the twisting roots, her passage stirring up clouds of lacewings which she puffed and shook away, her hands already occupied with her burden. Under her thin tunic, her skin was bristling. It was much cooler under the canopy, light and shadow dappling the ground in ever-changing patterns as the breeze danced through the leaves above. The noise was getting louder, echoing eerily off the trunks, and it was not long until she found the source. Though the local climes were dry, the trees about her were green and verdant, the scrubby undergrowth just as flourishing, perhaps fed by some underground spring, and what little dead wood that might have fallen had already been collected by the local village, a no-man forced to harvest a few branches from the trees with Minsk's small hand axe. He made for a striking silhouette, tall and broad, one hand bracing the thin branch while the other hacked at it with short, rhythmic strokes. Frithia paused at a stout trunk a few yards from him, unsure if her presence there was still unnoticed or merely being ignored.
Don't let Jahara see you taking it from the trees.
A no-man glanced to her and said nothing, no pause to his work. Frithia set the 2 flasks in the hollow of roots before her and drew herself up. It had been a long time in the coming, but he needed to know.
Actually, I've been meaning to speak to you. How are you, a no-man? It seems ages since we talked. I am well enough, my lady.
She had been expecting that, the question more for her than any concern she had for him, a build-up to the task that had been pressing on her since they had left the desert. She could feel the shape of it in her pocket, its importance lending it a greater weight than it owed.
Well, that is good. I have something for you, a no-man. When we left the Amma, Jahara and I, well, we went through Brianna's pack. Jahara brought it from the desert and we knew we couldn't carry it forever. There was little in it, just clothes and equipment, which we left with the tribe, but we did find this.
He stared at the small wooden doll she was holding up to him, the stout little figurine barely larger than her palm, faded paint depicting a dark-haired woman in cheerful yellow robes.
It is a filial idol. They are used in Kalimshan to represent ancestors in prayers of remembrance and observance that can rest alongside worship of the high gods. Such as Baal.
He sneered. Frithia pressed past the predictable anger.
I only mention it because there was no reason for Brianna to carry it as part of any deception. It was hers, a no-man, a real part of her.
A no-man hefted the axe, returning his attention to the branch above.
I don't want it. A no-man. I want nothing from either of you.
The sudden stab closed her throat on any protest she would have made, hurt burnt away in that instant of rage as she resisted lobbing the thing at his head and shoved the doll brutally back into her pocket.
Fine. I can do that.
She stooped for her flasks, the crack of splintering wood following her out into the plains once more.
And grip a little tighter.
Valigar squeezed Jahara's stave as she had instructed, eyes cast over the river beside them in an effort to ignore the pain. The chattering water was almost completely obscured by reeds, dragonflies dancing just above the surface, their iridescent colors muted by the coming darkness. They had settled on the grassy bank a half hour ago, Jahara laying out the blanket and some oils while Imoen filled the cooking pot, both massage and icy water going a long way to reducing the swelling in his hand.
Good, and relax.
Jahara leaned back, releasing his hand with a satisfied nod.
Yes, the bones are healing straight as we'd hope, you are definitely making progress.
Valigar said nothing at first. The examination had left his fingers more flexible than usual, but pained for it. He ignored the flare of angry joints, flexing the hand that not only no longer felt a part of him, but was now an enemy, too. The question faltered from his lips before he could stifle it.
And you notice nothing else about it, no changes? No, nothing other than it is improving.
The woman smiled, gesturing for him to give her his hand once more, her own placed above and below it as she closed her eyes and began the murmured prayer. A warm tingle, almost a tremble, quivered through his flesh and, for a moment, the near-constant ache faded away. It was over all too soon, though, the pain slowly returning as she drew back.
There, that should help it along.
The ranger let it rest in his lap. The woman stooped again and packing away the jars at her feet. Valigar felt the question pulling.
What does it feel like when you cast?
Jahara straightened slowly, a frown quirking in mild reflection.
It feels like a gate opening, and through me flows a fraction of my Lord's will or energy, I do not know what you would call it, and for an instant I am connected to everything.
He followed her hand as Jahara swept it across the bank.
The grasses, the river, the darting dragonflies, we are all one in my God. Though I do not know if all clerics feel the same.
She continued practically,
Sylvanus is of nature, after all. Perhaps a no-man feels Helm's strength, some vital burst of vigilance, or maybe what each priest feels is as personal as they are. Have you ever cast without a prayer? You mean with a thought or instinct?
She confirmed, seeming surprised he had asked.
No, though I do not believe it is the prayers that summon the power. My being worships Sylvanus in every breath I draw, he needs no veneration from me to know it. But the mantra helps to focus me, to ready my body and open it to the power. As far as I know, such instant power is the realm of sorcerers, and mages to a lesser extent. How does the weave feel?
Valigar spluttered past the sudden heat in his face.
What makes you believe I would know?
To his utmost bewilderment, Jahara was chuckling.
According to Imoen, you were educated in the art until the age of 14, you must have been a very poor student not to have cast a single spell in all that time.
The memory flashed. Standing in the study with Alargard, struggling to draw out enough of the weave for a levitation cantrip had felt like putting a small hole in a dam, all the while fearful of the massive weight of water that loomed behind it just waiting to break through and engulf him. He had found the powers he held frightening back then, perhaps that was why it had been so easy for him to dismiss the whole as evil. Whatever the truth of it, the night in Thine Gate had been very different, the magic then had felt controlled and, as such, far more terrifying.
The weave, it does not feel as you describe, at least it did not for me, it is an ocean of power waiting to swamp you, but resisting too, as though it would have drowned you before you could have ever hoped to drain it. It was not a feeling I found pleasant. Imoen does not describe it so,
the woman observed, something calculating behind the mild tone. Valigar affected a shrug.
No, but she is far more attuned than I. That is what they say of sorcerers, that they are born with the weave within them and magic at their will. Were there none of your family so endowed? With your lineage I would have expected at least a couple.
Valigar swallowed dryly, eyes drawn unwillingly to the crumpled hand that rested now so innocuously within his lap.
No one.
He could hear her frown.
Valigar, is something troubling you?
The confession was pressing.
In thine gate, Fritha!
He cried, the girl suddenly emerging from the grass behind. She stopped at her name, looking rather hurt by his shout.
Sorry, did I interrupt something? No, of course not,
he dismissed quickly. Jahara did not appear as certain, Fritha glancing between them with a frown.
Mon not with you. No, she returned to camp a while ago,
answered Jahara. Fritha nodded, seemingly waiting for something more. The unease over them was palpable.
Well, I'll just get these filled then.
Fritha continued at length, setting down one of the flasks to pick her way down through the reeds. Silence held them as she filled the flasks, Jahara making a show packing her bag, though Fritha could tell the pair would not be making any move to leave with her. Her feet were numb by the time she had finished, sandals squelching with that first step back onto the bank.
Well, that's me done. I'll see you both back at camp then.
A murmur of agreement followed her through the grasses, Fritha marching as quickly as she could manage with those two heavy flasks swinging from her arms. She did not know what she had interrupted between those two, and she did not care. She was just heartily sick of being made to feel as though she wasn't welcome in her own group. Perhaps Mon knew what was going on. If they had been behaving like that with her, no wonder she had returned to camp. There was no sign of the girl, though, at the fire. Fritha set down the sloshing flasks. She must have retired. The tent Mon shared with Valigar was the last in the uneven half-circle they had been pitched in, Fritha dropping to her knees before it and rapping playfully on the frame to push past the flap.
Hey, I am!
The shriek hit her the instant her head was inside, Mon scrambling to shove something under the blankets of the bedding she was sitting up in.
Gods, Fritha, don't you knock!
Sorry, Fritha soothed, nervous laughter pulled back to a smile.
I didn't think you would mind. What's under the blankets?
Mon practically exploded.
The rest of me. Can't I have any privacy?
Fritha drew back, not sure whether to be embarrassed or hurt.
Sorry, I'll leave you to it.
Outside, Minsk and Solafane had returned, the men talking over the fire. Solafane glanced up as she stalked past.
Fritha, is something wrong? Don't ask.
Fritha was merely glad she had laid her bedding down earlier, the girl slapping aside the flap to her tent to collapse into the blankets within. Her sandals kicked furiously to the corner, she threw an arm across her eyes in a meager effort to block out the world, tensions in her forehead little soothed by the smooth, cool skin. Everything was hard enough with worrying about the bounty and the prophesy and sodding Balthazar's sodding cure without her friends adding to it. A rustle at her feet, Fritha did not look up to see him enter on his knees, though the concern to his voice was unmistakable.
Fritha! How was the hunt?
Solafane sighed, disappointed by this coolness, but he answered her anyway.
There is nothing in the traps yet, though I will check again during my watch.
Another sigh, the body edging closer, and she could feel his presence above.
Talk to me, Fritha. Talk.
She snorted.
Now you wish to talk.
She felt him draw back, flustered.
I do not know what you mean. No? Well, I can hardly hold your silence against you, it seems no one wants my company of late. Has a no man upset you? He certainly gave it a good try. But at least he has an excuse. Imoen's been snapping at me for days and gods only know how I've offended the rest of you. I am sorry.
Something about his voice, that weary defeat to his tone, made her move her arm, and her eyes were, at last, unveiled as she shifted it up to cradle her head. He was looking down at her, a sadness she more than recognized etched on his fine features.
I am here now, Fritha.
The knot within her chest was slowly loosening, resentment ebbing away to leave nothing but that enduring melancholy.
Yes, you are. And now I find I have nothing to say. Are you worried about the bounty?
He pressed. She affected what shrug she could in that position.
No, not really. Not as much as I likely should be. Then what is wrong?
What was wrong? In truth, though the bounty and her other troubles lingered ever at the back of her thoughts, they were not the source of her sadness. But with Imoen still in a temper and a noman's continuing resolve to make an enemy of her, coupled with Solophane's recent distance, it just felt like no one was on her side anymore. And she could tell him that, and he would sigh and say she was wrong, and that she should tell them all the truth of everything in the same tired argument they had had since Saradush.
Nothing,
she muttered finally, wishing she had not drawn back her arm.
It doesn't matter.
The drow opened his mouth and stopped. Perhaps the admonishment he had planned for her keeping secrets had reminded him she was not alone in that. He turned away, unable to meet her eye as uncertain fingers reached for the hand that lolled above her head to close about her own.
Then perhaps we can just talk a while.
The heat rising in her chest somehow intensified the ache that had throbbed there for days now, that knot within tightening again as she was presented with a chance to forget it all, even for a short while. The sly smile was suddenly playing, unbidden, about her mouth, hesitation well hidden beneath.
Now, why would we waste our efforts on such mild pleasures, Sola?
He met her eye then, his looked wary, as though caution and curiosity were at war.
And on what would you have us waste our efforts? Well, I believe there was a promise of henna. My canvas awaits your hand.
She watched him watch her, her face coloring under that intense gaze as she lay beneath him in wanton vulnerability. Something had to give. Slowly she drew her leg up to press along his outer thigh. He shuddered, a frisson that traveled from spine to skull, and suddenly he was gone, Minsk's shout seemingly doing nothing to halt him. Fritha lay still, unwilling to move, trying not to think. Her mind was reeling with hot-faced confusion, nausea-fighting tears as the tension finally broke. What was she doing? Fritha lay motionless, an arm across her eyes and sparing them from the glary, green sky. Winds were whipping across the tiled plain to pull at her thin trousers, while her body and head had found shelter in the bulk of the large man sat above her.
Why do I do these things? Why do I seem to feel the need to sabotage my life on a regular basis? Care to elaborate, sister?
Fritha just groaned, her refusal stemming more from the burning desire to forget all about it, than any reluctance to discuss her confused attempts at seduction with her dead brother. The silence stretched on, that coil inside her chest growing tighter, until...
I am such a fucking idiot.
The curse went ringing up into the boiling sky, and Fritha felt marginally better for it, at last sitting to face the man next to her, her hair instantly whipped up by the wind into a thrashing amber halo. Saravek raised an eyebrow as she fought to gather it back.
You seem frustrated, your plans do not progress as you would wish. My plans, as they are going well enough, even with me attempting to thwart them at every turn.
She sighed, scrubbing a hand across her face, angered that sleep had been no release from the torment of going over and over her foolishness.
"Oh, why did I tell him that?"
"Him?" repeated Saravuk gravely and seeming to draw all the conclusion he needed from the single syllable as he continued.
"Now, sister, is not the time to be allowing any relations to hinder with your purpose."
"No," she agreed tiredly, "it is not." The warrior nodded, satisfied she was approaching matters sensibly. Fritha drew a deep breath and, at last, put her self-destructive silliness aside, neatly crossing her legs as though physically settling into their discussion.
"Right then, back to more pressing matters. Do you know anything of a man named Balthazar?" "I have never heard that name before." "What about the Order of?"
Fritha realized to her consternation she had not bothered to inquire as to its full title.
"Ulgit."
She ventured hopefully in the name of its founder, hastening to add,
"It's an order of monks in Amkithran, apparently dead set on ending the curse."
Saravuk remained coolly impassive.
"And how do they plan on that?"
Fritha shrugged.
"Balthazar would not say, though he seemed very sure he could end."
She paused, recalling the meeting again and the myriad of emotions it had stirred.
"I sensed no deception in him." "The curse cannot be ended,"
scoffed Saravuk impatiently.
"If this Balthazar believes it can be, he is deluding himself. As for the monastery, I have never heard of it, but I confess I did not journey as far south as Kalimshan when I travelled in study of my heritage."
He stopped, the warrior eyeing her incredulously.
"Surely, sister, you did not believe he—" "Not for an instant,"
Fritha cut in,
"but others in my group."
Saravuk eased back where he sat, nodding wisely.
"Ah, they are trying to tempt you from your true path with these false hopes."
"No," she corrected with genuine surprise, as though she herself had only just realized the fact as she confessed,
"Only to even know of what I plan."
The warrior looked mildly impressed.
"A wise decision."
Fritha shook her head, the wind taking the opportunity to try and free the hair she had bound back.
"I am beginning to doubt it is. I lead them onward, letting them risk their lives for a cause of which they do not even understand the full consequences." "And why should they know?" "Because they are supposed to be my friends,"
she countered, feeling for the first time the sting of her betrayal.
"You know, friends, I'm sure you had at least one while you still breathed." "I had a few, sister, as useful as they were. I gathered them about me over the years, men and women who I could trust to serve me, not merely realtor or their own interests within the Iron Throne." "Servants don't count,"
Fritha goaded, her spite rewarded as temper drew out truths.
"They were not mere lackeys. They were loyal companions and I favored their company. Especially in the early days, before my true path was laid before me and there was time for such diversions. I trained with them, drank and laughed even as we plotted Rielter's downfall. These were the only people who saw me as I was, not that facade of the Sembian noble my father had made me wear. Though, even as close as we were, I never saw the need to tell any of them I was of the children." "Why? I cannot imagine it would have put them off, not after what they were willing to follow you in."
She watched as his eyes dropped to consider it.
"I do not know. It was not that I did not trust them with the knowledge and yet. I told only to Moko in the end, and she used it as an excuse for all I became."
He spat the last few words with the bitter rancor she was used to whenever he mentioned the lover he had tossed aside on his quest for godhood. Fritha watched him for a long while, taking in the hunched shoulders, his hoary hair swirling fitfully about that pale, wizened face. Only his eyes held any spark of the old fire he had once been so alive with, yet even they were muted now, dulled by more than any man should see. Had he once laughed with his friends in genuine, warm camaraderie? Could a heart that would have killed thousands for power, enslaved innocents, and raised armies to bring a war to the Sword Coast with all the horrors that would have entailed, also held an affection for those called friends, shown them kindness and esteem?
Do you regret it?
She asked. The quiet question earned a sharp response.
Regret what? Dying? Having all I planned destroyed? No, do you regret leading them to their deaths? I led them nowhere,
he dismissed.
They followed of their own will, just as your own group do, only the weak do not take responsibility for their own actions. Yes, but they follow on half a story. It's not good enough and I owe them better than this. I should tell them.
She announced to the howling plains, something inside her stealing.
I'm going to tell them. Besides, the way things are now, I doubt some of them could like me any less.
Saravek looked as though he would have grabbed her had he dared, the man hastening to forestall this folly.
Do not do this, sister. You jeopardize everything for a nagging conscience. If they know you mean to aim for the throne, then they will know the results of your failure, becoming Baal. They could refuse to aid you, they could attempt to kill you.
Fritha raised a highly skeptical eyebrow. Saravek reconsidered his position with a dull frown.
No, perhaps those of your company would never consider such a step. But this decision could have far-reaching consequences. What if they refuse to continue on this quest for Sendai and instead demand you find another path, a way to avoid your fate? Your quest cannot afford delay or doubts.
He paused, watching the indecision mull behind her eyes, his voice softer as he added,
You must share these worries, or you would have told them already yourself.
Saravek muted her with that penetrating gaze.
Do not be ashamed, sister, of an instinct that assures your survival, however selfish. Others may demand truths, honor, justice, but it is ones such as you and I who know the true price of these civilities, and when they must be sacrificed for the greater goal. Like inciting a war.
She sniped, but there was little of the old indignation left in it. He was right after all. She had lied, murdered, cheated, all in the name of retrieving Imoen and then her soul. And it seemed she would do all that and more for the throne. Somewhere in the greater multiverse she imagined what whispering memories that remained of Baal smiling, the family resemblance was closer than she liked to admit. End of chapter.